Back in late 2020, the announcement that IO Interactive were working on a brand new, wholly original James Bond game came as welcome relief to fans of 007 in gaming, especially given we haven't had a AAA Bond adventure on a console since 2012, and the less said about 007 Legends, the better. I'm making this video almost 4 years after the initial announcement that the game was being made, and since then we've had next to no concrete information on it at all. To be honest, we barely know anything more about it than we did when it was first announced, and between waiting for this game alongside waiting for the next iteration of cinematic Bond, I do sometimes wonder if us 007 fans were just made to suffer.
It's our lot in life.
Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, but that won't stop us from speculating and indeed dreaming about what could be just over the horizon. For many fans, the pairing of Hitman producer IO Interactive and James Bond is an absolute dream come true, and if they're taking all this time to craft a triumphant return to console gaming for James Bond, then it's all gonna be worth it. I often get asked what my hopes and dreams are for this release, so I thought it'd be a good idea to make a video covering the basis of what I want, but also what I'm expecting from Project 007. While there hasn't been all that much official information released so far, there have been some comments from executives and tidbits extracted from job postings and such that means we can maybe be a little bit more informed on some things. So let's get started with probably the most important aspect of the whole project, James Bond himself. One of the first bits of information released about the game was that it would be a wholly original James Bond origin story, and given that there is no incumbent cinematic Bond actor, it looks like we'll be getting a Bond that will be unique to this video game world that IO Interactive are creating. Personally speaking, I love this idea. I've mentioned before that I loved it when EA Games created their own Bond model for Agent Under Fire. There was also an original Bond in GoldenEye Rogue Agent, and more recently in 007 Cypher, and I think not tying this Bond to any particular cinematic incarnation can only be a good thing. But this Bond will presumably still have traits of some of his former cinematic counterparts, and I think we can glean some information from a job posting on the IO Interactive website for a senior writer position on the game that lists as part of the job requirements the ability to write sharp, witty, and authentic dialogue that follows our James Bond North Star document, including his signature wit and charm. Ensure the narrative reflects British culture accurately, with a keen understanding of its humour, nuances, and social dynamics. The mentions of wit and humour are quite interesting. Like, while I do think it is a major generalisation to say that the Daniel Craig films are humourless, they do still have a lot of very funny moments and lines in them. I do still think that the purveying sense is that they are drier and less dependent on humour than previous incarnations of Bond, so the idea that this game could maybe go back to the kinds of sense of humour that we'd see in classic Bond films is one that I am completely on board with. Indeed, I have a feeling that the game version of Bond will be something of a Connery Brosnan kind of figure. By that I mean a bit of an all-rounder kind of Bond when it comes to being the action hero, the cold, ruthless killer agent, and then also someone who can land a gag and deliver a witty line when needed. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that this game is going to be full-on camp, Blofeld in drag, Sheriff J.W. Pepper, Tarzan yelling gags, but I suspect it's going to go for a more general tonal approach. Though in a Gamesradar article detailing a studio visit to IO Interactive, they did make comments that our time in the office suggests a tone closer to Daniel Craig than Roger Moore. I still think there's a middle ground here though, and like I say, a Connery Brosnan kind of tone would suit me incredibly well. Given that the story will feature Bond earning his 00 status, I think he'll clearly be on the younger end, early 30s, possibly even late 20s, making him, I guess, our first millennial James Bond. In terms of looks, again, I have a feeling that they're going to try to go for something of a classic Bond look with dark hair, traditionally handsome features, but I also think they'll give him a generous helping of ruggedness. I think they're going to want to cover a lot of bases with his portrayal, and this is all music to my ears. It'll be interesting when it's revealed who is going to be voicing the character. I think we're probably a ways off from that being announced, but it could well be that we actually get an announcement of who this Bond is going to be before we get one concerning the next cinematic actor. And while the idea that a video game Bond is voiced by someone other than one of the film actors is nothing new, I do think that this will likely be the most significant Bond video game casting ever, especially if there's an eye to making more of these in the future, and then there's the question of whether they'll take the actor's likeness as well. I mean, lots of interesting stuff coming up on the Bond casting front. I may even be more excited for the game casting than I am the next movie casting. On to the story next, and I do think that the immediate question is whether or not they're going to be setting this in the past, in the 1950s or 60s, or whether it'll be a more contemporary setting. From Russia With Love is proof that a Bond game can indeed work if it's set in the past, but given that this is being being billed as a wholly original origin story, I'm inclined to say that it's going to be set in the present day rather than sometime in the past. I just think if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 40s, I mean, whatever, it immediately becomes somewhat tied in with either the Fleming origins of the character on the page or the cinematic origins, and I feel like they're going to want to really put their stamp on this as being their own unique thing, and I'm totally down with that. So it's an origin story. Bond is going to earn his 00 status, which means that there will be two very key moments in the gameplay, and I'm guessing that those are going to be the 2 kills that you need to make in order to become a 00 agent. Now, I kind of hope that that is really just like the first mission, or indeed the first 2 missions, and that the whole game isn't just about building up to just 2 kills, because that will presumably mean that you do only kill 2 people over the course of the whole game, and I love me a firefight in a Bond game, unless everyone is just putting each other to sleep, like in 007 Cypher. If this game is going to have a longevity, then the story will most certainly need to be expanded out beyond, like, what you would get in a typical Bond film, I think. I'm kind of hoping that missions revolve around individual episodes, kind of like how Cypher did, to be honest. Like, you have a bunch of levels that come together to form their own story, but there's a thread throughout the whole thing, and then the final chapter or the final set of levels is you going after the head of whichever villainous organization, the boss, or whatever that you're fighting. Bond games in the past have done really well crafting stories that could well be made into a singular film, like Bloodstone, Everything or Nothing spring to mind as great examples of that, but I do think that if Project 007 is going to justify the amount of development time it's taking, I think it's going to need to feel more like 3 or 4 or even more individual stories that could be films that come together as one at the end or are interconnected in some way. So basically, I think and hope, in fact, that we're going to have kind of a multiple main villain scenario, like similar to like how in the movies, like how Dr. No is the main bad guy for that film, Largo for another, Rosa Klebb for another, but they all report to Blofeld, who is essentially the main bad guy to take down. At least that's what I'm leaning towards as a possibility. So basically a bunch of chapters that are all about thwarting villains' individual schemes and then going on to fight the head of the organization, stop their world domination plot, is pretty much exactly what I'm wanting to get out of this story-wise. I'm fully anticipating that the game will be comprised of completely original characters, but I wouldn't actually mind it if they repurposed some classic Bond characters in new roles. I don't want the villains roster to be a complete all-stars of Bond sort of thing, like in GoldenEye Rogue Agent, but I think that if they dropped in a Jaws or a Xenia or an Oddjob, similar to how Bond games in the past have done, Everything or Nothing being an example, I'd be really down for that. I've definitely had enough of Spectre as an organization after the last couple of Craig-era films, so I'd be totally cool with a new and unique villainous group that isn't headed by a bald man called Blofeld. Almost certainly we'll have M, Moneypenny and Q making appearances, and I'll get to gadgets in a bit, but I think it'll be very interesting to see where they land with the Bond girl, or indeed Bond girls of the story. It wouldn't surprise me if there's kind of like a female agent type in here that Bond sleeps with, and I'd kind of love it if the, charming information out of someone was a mission. Like, it's such a staple of the films that Bond beds women in order to get information out of them, and I think it'd be cool to see that realized in video game form. In terms of a wider romantic interest to be involved in the story, though, I'm kind of fine with there not being one. I definitely don't think we need to do the whole Vesper-style betrayal thing again, but I definitely want Bond girls to be involved in the story in some way. Character and story are obviously very important when it comes to James Bond, but what's more important is that Project 007 is a fun experience to pick up and play, and when it comes to the gameplay itself, I have a significant wish list. I would assume that the Hitman games are going to be a good indication of what we can expect from Project 007, and indeed, it sounds like, based on previous job recruitment ads, that it is going to be in the third-person perspective, which is all good by me, but I am nonetheless a big fan of first-person perspective Bond presentation, so it'd be cool if there was an option in places to switch to a first-person mode, kind of like what you get in Grand Theft Auto, even if it is just for certain moments. I think IO Interactive will be keen for this not to just feel like a reskinned Hitman, but it would be cool to have elements of Hitman's sandbox-style gameplay in here, like options to go in all guns blazing, or take stealthier approaches in places. I assume it won't be as heavy on the firefights as we've become accustomed to in Bond games of the past, and I suspect that there will be an emphasis on stealth and spying and gathering intelligence via non-lethal means, and I'm good with that in moderation, but I still want there to be sections of gameplay where it is just balls to the wall shooting action, and I assume that'll be there because in part this is something that's kind of baked into the Bond gaming brand and the audiences will be expecting it to a certain degree. Though I don't have my hopes up too much. Again, in the Gamesradar article showcasing IO Interactive, an interview with CEO Hakam Abrak revealed that Eon apparently weren't especially happy with how violent other Bond games have become. Our impression was clearly that they were not looking for a game, Abrak says, and I think it's fair to say that they might not have been super happy with some of the later games. Moving away from action-oriented shooters, in Elverdam's words, seemed to have been part of his pitch, presenting Hitman as a game in which violence is actually discouraged, with the exception of one or two very specific murders per level, of course. That helped us convince the Eon group that there's a sophistication in how we treat the agent fantasy. Which is fine in concept, and I get it, and just because you're not mowing down waves upon waves of goons doesn't mean that the game can't be fun in a different way. I'm just hoping that the whole experience isn't too watered down in terms of violence, because hey, that is still a part of James Bond's whole life and persona after all, and even if he's not killing someone to make a statement, high-octane action, stunts and explosions do follow James Bond around, so I don't think that mission objectives will be too subdued, or at least I'm certainly hoping they won't be. From my own experiences of playing some Hitman levels, I was really taken by the level of detail in every single environment, and the idea of this translating into the Bond space is super exciting for me. I don't think the levels will be quite as open-ended as they are in Hitman, but the idea of the team there putting together environments for MI6, for a huge Bondian villain's base, a glamorous casino and what have you, is very exciting. I think it's going to be an awful lot of fun to explore the environments in this game. Vehicle-based levels are incredibly high on my list. They became a bit of a staple feature of Bond games during the EA era, and the Activision games sort of tried to keep them going, but by that point in the series, gadgets were kind of passé in the movies, so the levels didn't quite hit the same way, because you're just sort of racing the cars rather than using gadgets, which just isn't as fun. But in Agent Under Fire, Nightfire, Everything or Nothing from Russia with Love, they got it just right. Like, getting behind the wheel of some fantastic vehicles armed with missiles, rockets, machine guns, oil slicks, smoke, invisibility. It was just an absolute joy for a Bond gamer, and I'm absolutely dying for this to be a returning feature. And on a similar level, just gadgets in general. In that same Gamesradar article that I've cited a couple of times already, they made mention of the game being pitched as the ultimate spycraft fantasy, and gadgets are just a crucial part of that formula, to me at least. Again, some of the Craig-era games had less of an emphasis on gadgets because of the films at the time. I mean, they didn't feature that many fantastical gadgets. Occasionally you'd have to get out your smartphone and it would do something, but damn it, I want a laser watch, an exploding pen, a rocket-firing boombox. One of the areas that I'm most excited about seeing realized in the game is the gadgets. The idea that certain missions could be done in a variety of different ways, depending on whether you use gadgets to go a certain way or not. I think it's a super exciting prospect. Another staple expectation of a Bond gaming experience, multiplayer, and I most certainly think, first of all, I think in a competitive sense, I think that there will be leaderboards for best times and scores in campaign levels and such, but I would also kind of love there to be a campaign co-op mode. It could be very exciting just to team up with a fellow 00 agent or something like that to complete objectives together. A competitive multiplayer, though, is what would get me very excited, and I'd love there to be some kind of online battle royale kind of thing. I had a real blast with the GoldenEye Reloaded online multiplayer when that game came out, and I'd love to relive something similar, something where if I've just got like half an hour and fancy some action, I can just hop on, have a few rounds, and more than likely get my ass handed to me and be done. I think the multiplayer is really where you could see former Bond characters come back to shine as multiplayer skins. I think it's probably too much to ask to expect all of the cinematic Bonds to be available as playable skins, but I certainly expect there to be a good amount of villains to choose from should such a feature be included, and I'm really hoping it will. It's been so long since we had a really good competitive online Bond presence, and the idea that, you know, we fans could organize our own tournaments and such is just an that would be a dream come true for me. And my final hope for Project 007, that it's available on multiple platforms to spread the Bond love around. Who knows if it'll even be released in time to make it onto the current generation of consoles. We may well end up experiencing Project 007 on the PS6 or Nintendo Switch 2, but wherever it does end up, I'm really hoping it's on multiple outlets to maximize the potential of the game to reach new fans. I really do think that there has been some big missed opportunities for Bond over the last decade or so by staying out of the gaming world in the way that it has, and I think it's a very exciting prospect that a whole new generation could experience Bond for the first time through Project 007, and given the pedigree of IO Interactive, my expectations and hopes are really high that when it does indeed arrive, it's going to be something very, very special indeed. Let me know in the comments below what your hopes and dreams are for Project 007. Also below are links to my various social media pages, and of course the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button. If you want to stay super up to date on future video uploads, please do consider clicking both of those, and until next time Bond fans, so long for now.